When a company like Volkswagen decides where to build its next factory, it's not just a business decision. It's a multi-billion-dollar bet that literally shapes our global economy. Well, that bet is what we call foreign direct investment. And today, we're going to peel back the curtain on the high-stakes game behind it.
Okay, so take a company like Volkswagen. You probably think of it as a German company, right? But here's the thing. It builds millions of cars every single year in 48 different factories, and they're scattered all across the globe. In fact, about 30% of its total sales come from China alone.
And that really begs a huge question, doesn't it? Why on earth would you go through the massive expense and the incredible risk of building a factory overseas? Why not just make all the cars at home and ship them out? It's a multi-billion-dollar question, and we're about to find the answer.
So what we're really digging into here is something called foreign direct investment, or FDI for short. And look, this isn't just about playing the stock market. This is about a company making a really substantial investment, buying up physical assets or a big chunk of a foreign company, all to gain actual management control.
All right, so to really get why this is happening, first we just got to get a sense of the sheer scale of it all. So let's start by mapping out this global flow of money.
Now, the flow of all this investment cash is anything but a smooth ride. The amount of money zipping across borders is incredibly volatile. I mean, we're talking massive peaks and deep valleys that often line up perfectly with major world events, like the global recession back around 2008. But even with all that turbulence, the amount of capital is just staggering.
And to put a number on it for you, get this. At its absolute peak in 2007, the world saw over $1.9 trillion in FDI in a single year. That is an almost unimaginable amount of money flowing between countries.
So, where's all this cash actually heading? Well, historically, it mostly poured into developed nations, places like the US and Europe. But, and this is huge, there's been a seismic shift. Developing nations are grabbing a bigger and bigger piece of that pie. In fact, in 2014, for the very first time, they actually brought in more FDI than all the developed countries combined. That's not just a small trend, folks. That's a fundamental rewrite of the global economic map.
Okay, so we know the scale is massive, and the patterns are totally shifting. But this brings us right back to our central mystery. Why? Why are companies actually doing this? Well, it turns out there are 4 key strategic reasons.
Let's break down the 4 big theories that really explain FDI. Think of them as the main plays in the global business playbook. First, you've got the product life cycle. The idea here is pretty simple. As a product gets older, it just makes sense to produce it in cheaper places. So a company might invent a new smartphone at home, sell it as an export for a while, but then, once everyone's making a similar phone and competition gets fierce, they build factories abroad to make it way more cheaply for the whole world.
Okay, next up, market imperfections. This theory basically says the global market isn't this perfectly smooth, frictionless machine. It has bumps and barriers. So a company uses FDI to internalize its business, bringing everything in-house in another country to get around those bumps and just operate more efficiently.
So what kind of imperfections are we talking about? Well, the most obvious one is a trade barrier, like a tariff. If a country slaps a huge tax on your imported cars, hey, building a factory inside that country is a pretty clever way to dodge it. Another big one is protecting your secret sauce. That special tech or unique process? It might just be too risky to license it to someone else who could steal it or become a competitor, so you build your own factory to keep it all under your control.
Then you've got something that sounds super academic, the eclectic theory. But honestly, it's just a simple checklist. People call it the OLI framework. FDI is the go-to move when a company has an ownership advantage, like a killer brand, finds a great location advantage, like cheap labor or raw materials, and has an internalization advantage, which just means it's better to do it yourself than to try and license or export. When O, L, and I all click into place, FDI is usually the winning move.
And finally, there's market power. Now this one's the most aggressive of them all. Sometimes FDI is just a straight-up power play. A company invests abroad to build a dominant presence, maybe by buying up all its suppliers. That's called vertical integration. And the goal? It's simple. Get more control over the entire industry so you have more power to set the prices you want.
Okay, so we've seen the playbook from the company's side. But what does this all look like from the other direction? For the countries actually receiving all this money, it's kind of like rolling out a very, very high-stakes welcome mat.
You see, for host governments, this is a real double-edged sword. On one hand, the benefits can be huge. FDI can bring in cutting-edge technology, create a ton of jobs, and give the country's finances a nice initial kickstart. But on the flip side, the drawbacks can be pretty severe. When those foreign companies send their profits back home, it can drain the host country's reserves. Local businesses might get totally crushed by the competition, and you could even lose some of your economic independence. It's a really tough balancing act.
So, to try and walk this tightrope, governments have a whole toolkit of levers they can pull. If they want to encourage FDI, they can offer sweet deals like tax breaks and cheap loans, or they can build better roads and ports. And if they want to control it, they can put up restrictions, like saying a foreign company can't own more than 50%, or they can make specific demands, like forcing them to export a certain amount of what they produce.
All right, so we've mapped the money, we've figured out the motives, and we've looked at the government's dilemma. But so what? What does any of this really mean for us? Let's connect the dots.
Here's the bottom line. Foreign direct investment isn't just some boring term in an economics textbook. It is literally the engine of globalization. These multi-billion-dollar decisions are what determine where the stuff we use every day is actually made, which communities get new jobs, and which countries are going to win or lose in the 21st century economy.
And, nothing captures this whole shift better than a quote from a former CEO of the company that owns Mercedes-Benz. He said, "It was once sacrosanct to talk about our cars being made in Germany. We have to change that to made by Mercedes and never mind where they are assembled." Wow, that is the modern global economy in a single sentence.
And that leaves us with one last big question for the future. As the world keeps changing, as supply chains get completely redrawn after all the global shocks we've seen, and as new economic giants like China and India go from just receiving FDI to becoming huge sources of it themselves, the whole game is changing again. So you have to ask yourself, who's going to write the rules for the next era of foreign direct investment?